Okay, so we're learning a talk from the Rebbe on Gimmel Tammuz, the third of Tammuz, that was said in 19 Tafshin Chai, Tafshin Yud Ches, 1958. So let's bring up the text. Okay. So, Sichas Shabbos Parshas Korach. This is Shabbos, the week of Korach. Gimmel Tammuz, the third of Tammuz, Taf Shin Chai, 1958. It says that on the star it says, La'achar Tefillah, after the davening in the morning, Bikshu Mikvoketishus Admar Shlita Li's Vaid. He asked if the Rebbe could bring the regel ha'opsharnish shel ha'chasan ha'ofrufnish shel ha'chasanim. For the Shabbos, that Shabbos in 1958, the Shabbos Korach, there were few grooms that were getting married, so they would have a fabring and what's called the ufrufnish and the kiddush. So the Rebbe answered, "Harizeh Gimmel Tammuz." It's Gimmel Tammuz, meaning because Gimmel Tammuz was a date even before it became a date of the Rebbe's passing, of the Rebbe's yahrzeit. And what happened on Gimmel Tammuz before that in 1927? So the Rebbe says, Gimmel Tammuz, so the third of Tammuz, Hu hayoyim asher ba yotzei kvod kedushes morichami admer mimasarei b'shnas tafresh bezayin. So in the Chabad calendar, Gimmel, the third of Tammuz, was a date already from 1927. In 1927, on the 15th of Sivan, the previous Lubavitch Rebbe was arrested for his efforts in Torah mitzvahs and specifically spreading Yiddishkeit and Jewish education. So he was arrested on the 15th. It was a very hold on a second. It was a very severe situation. He's Lord of Shimon, and his imprisonment was lessened on the 3rd of Tammuz. He was sent to exile for 3 years in the city of Kostroma. That ended up being 10 days. And that's why we celebrate the 15th, the 13th, and the 12th and the 13th of Tammuz, Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, the Chag HaGeula, when the Friedrich Rebbe was totally redeemed. So it says like this. So he was let out of prison on the 3rd of Tammuz, 1927, on the condition that that same day, not even stay the day, he would travel Li'ir Meklatai to his refuge or to his exile in the city of Kostroma for Al-Meshach Shalosh Shanim for 3 years. Ubihiyayse Sham, and once he was there in Kostroma, he means he actually traveled there. It turned out on the 12th of Tammuz, which is again 9 days after he was taken out of prison. After, remember, the imprisonment initially, they were going to put him to death, God forbid. Is idea Allah mi beis hapikidus, they let him know on the 12th from the office over there of the communist in Kostroma, that he actually gave him a total freedom. He doesn't have to stay in Kostroma in his exile. And they were only, because of technical reasons, I think it was a holiday, they were only able to give him his total freedom, his papers, on the 13th. So he would have to wait till the 13th in order to get his total freedom. So this ended up becoming, Gimmel Tammuz ended up becoming the beginning of the redemption. So the Rebbe says, the Rebbe is going to explain. B'shaita, in the year 1927, the day of Gimmel Tammuz was seemingly a sad day. Hayu ke'ela, there were those, meaning those of the Chabad community, shehistapku b'negei la yitziyah ma'amaiser b'Gimmel Tammuz. They didn't know how to relate to the Rebbe's being sent off to exile, because that was a sad thing. The Rebbe is supposed to be with Chassidim, both for the Rebbe's sake and for the Chassidim's sake. And now the Rebbe was sent off to Kostroma. We learned that it was very difficult for the Rebbe there, even those 9 days. They didn't know if to be happy or not, because it means better than the alternative of being in jail or, God forbid, put to death, but it's still not good. His whole getting out of prison was on condition he goes to exile. The Rebbe was then already a son-in-law of the previous Rebbe. Although the Rebbe didn't get married yet, but he was, first of all, a relative of the previous Rebbe, and he was also his son-in-law, and he was already also involved actually with the happenings of what was going on in those days in 1927 around the arrest and freedom of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, his future father-in-law, and of course cousin. So he said those who were there, so the Rebbe is saying he was there, those who were on location, so to say, on point, the Yadu Prati Amatzav, and he understood the severity of the situation. Yadu Bipshitis, it was obvious, the Rebbe said, to those on the know, the Loi Safik Klal, without any doubt, Shayitzima Maiser the Golas, that the previous Rebbe is getting out of imprisonment, even if it was going to exile, he me'aver min akatza lakatza was a total different extreme of how bad it was in prison. Besides the fact that the previous Rebbe's life was endangered and imprisoned, he was physically beat there, but the torture that he went through was horrible, was horrific. And so much was it an extreme to the positive. So because of that, and the Rebbe says, in some ways, the third of Tammuz has a simcha yisera, a greater joy, even than the 12th and 13th of Tammuz. Now you have to remember, today we're sitting here not 2026, but for Chassidim in America, when I grew up in the 80s and 70s, 60s, and 50s, Jews basically Gimmel Tammuz was as great, or even in some ways greater than Yud Tes Kislev. I mean, it's still today, but those were people that lived there. My great-grandfather, people that were alive in the story, even my grandfather, they knew the story and the danger. This was a huge day of celebration. And the Rebbe said those who are on the in some ways, Gimmel Tammuz was a greater day than Yud Beis Yud Gimel because of what he was being saved from. Ki Geulas Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, Ki Geula Migolas. Because the redemption, so to say, the total freedom that the previous Rebbe received on the 13th and 12th and 13th of Tammuz was from a situation of exile, which was bad. But it wasn't as bad as getting out of prison. You can't compare exile to redemption than from imprisonment to freedom. Even if the freedom was conditional of being exiled from your home, family, and community. Means what the Rebbe is explaining to the kahal, to the fabrengen. Like they said, they came to the Rebbe and they asked the Rebbe to fabreng for an ufruv. So the Rebbe says, ufruv, it's Gimmel Tammuz. And Gimmel Tammuz is, the Rebbe is explaining how it's a more important day for Chassidim, celebrating the Friedrich Rebbe's freedom. And the Friedrich Rebbe's freedom is not a celebration of an individual's freedom. It's a freedom of Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe is a Rebbe of Klal Yisrael. Is a pratisya, so the Rebbe says to be more deep, to explain more in detail. Hanimtza b'maiser, if someone's in prison, you have no freedom. You have no decisions. You can't decide to do anything. Like it describes by Yosef HaTzadik. When you're in prison, everything they decide when you eat, when you sleep, what you do, 24 hours, 24/7. And those who could read, it's in English, translated, Hebrew, Yiddish, of course, of the details. The Friedrich Rebbe described in detail his experience in prison and the horrific situation that he was in under the communists. And you can see clearly he had absolutely no freedom. But if you're in exile, as how horrible as exile is, as the Chinuch Sefer says, that those who had to go to city of refuge, which is a type of exile, is Goydel Hatzar, the great pain, Mekachshma freedom, Esa Adami Mikara V'Re'ev, when you're no longer next to those who you know, are familiar with, and those you're close with, you're friendly with, because you go to Gauls, you're away from everyone, you're unfamiliar territory. When we call in Yanim Shehurgelbam, you're out of your accustomed space. At the end of the day, you're lacking certain levels of comfort or what you're accustomed to. But your whole life is in an imprisonment. You have freedom, you have a place to live, you have a place to sleep. You still have the freedom. You could decide when you eat breakfast, lunch, and supper. You could decide what you eat for a breakfast, lunch, and supper. The communists weren't telling the Friedrich Rebbe what to do. They just stay over there and don't be next to anyone. You're as far as they were concerned, the previous Rebbe was a liability. Being around Chassidim, because what would he do? He would tell people to open a mikvah. He would tell women to go to the mikvah. He would tell the fathers and mothers to give circumcision. he would say to the people, you have to send your kids to that Jewish education. So as far as they're concerned, let him be out in Kastrama, in exile, and he won't bother their plan of assimilating the Jews and other religions. And like everything, you have to find this in Torah. There's a difference between when a person is living a life of imprisonment or a person is in exile, how it refers to our performance of Torah mitzvahs. Bisman HaGolas, the Jewish people now, we're in Golas, we're in exile. Like it says, because of our sins, we've been exiled from our land. And that includes the way we are now, even with the 9 million Knainahar plus Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, it's a matzav of Golas, of exile. Until today, like we learned in our Gemara class this week, we don't have the laws all the laws that are connected to Eretz Yisrael. Today, we're not careful with Tumah Tara. We don't have the laws of Kach. A big chunk, a big part of Torah mitzvahs are not things that we're involved in today, right? Because we learned about all the laws of how difficult it is to be pure and impure. And also in exile, and that is applicable till today, everywhere in the world, unfortunately, in a way in Eretz Yisrael as well, where it's lacking the light that's associated with the performance of Torah mitzvahs. Nevertheless, although we're in Golas, and we have a Golas, and the Golas can affect in certain times, in certain places throughout our history in the past 2,000 years, but at the end of the day, in most situations, we have the freedom, let's say today especially in the United States and other places in the world, to be Jewish under the circumstances that we have. You have freedom of choice. And the Torah tells you, because you have a freedom of choice, what choice should you make? Choose life, which is Torah. For anything that you can do in Torah mitzvahs. No one's forcing you to eat non-kosher food. No one's forcing you to do something else that's not related to Torah mitzvahs. You decide. You can have your reasons for why you want to do it or not do something. But to say that you're being forced to eat non-kosher food, that you can't say. But if someone is in prison, you don't have any choice. You can't make any choices. You have no choices to perform the mitzvahs. If you're in prison, under certain circumstances, especially how the Friedrich Rebbe was in Russia, he had his tefillin later, but you don't have a Sefer Torah. If the Friedrich Rebbe would have been there for Sukkot, I highly doubt he would have given him an esrog. And there's responses, because in history there have been individuals or communities, unfortunately, that have been taken into levels of imprisonment. In Moshe, under the Jewish people, under the communists, it wasn't really for the 30, 40 years of under communism, strict communism. It was more of a situation of masar, of imprisonment, than it was of galus, because literally you were not allowed to do anything. The Rebbe says, imagine something like this. What does it mean to have a freedom of choice? The idea of freedom of choice means you have the choice to choose according to your will, to what you want. Therefore, only a person has that ability. Bechira was only given to the human beings. And as the Torah itself says, in the beginning of creation, that one of the concerns of the creation of human is that humans have the choice, like godliness, to choose something. And the problem was that in the first generations until the flood, and kind of afterwards in a lot of times as well, we weren't choosing right. That's why there was a flood. Uvemina Adam Gufa, and we're within the human species, within the Jewish people specifically. Because the Jewish people are rooted in the essence of God, not just bechitzon, not externally, but in the Pnimiyus, internally with God. The true freedom of choice is only by God. There's nothing. It means even a freedom of choice, you have a freedom of choice to do things when you have a choice to do it. If you have no choice, there could be obstacles. God has no obstacles. If God decides to do something, there are no obstacles. If he wants to call it an obstacle, it's because he created an obstacle for himself, but not that there's a real obstacle. And Jewish people are rooted in Hashem. So there's also no maniya v'ikuv when it comes to Bechira Chavshis for a year to do Torah mitzvahs. V'inin ha-Bechira Chavshis, yeshna etzel b'nei Yisrael, gam kasher nimtzoim golos. and the ability for freedom of choice we have in Galus. Yes, it's not so great. We don't have all the mitzvahs. So therefore, the Rebbe is saying, but a person in imprisonment doesn't have these choices. So therefore, the Rebbe is saying those who knew how bad the situation was for the previous Rebbe. You have to remember, not everyone knew. Not everyone knew during or after. And the Rebbe was there because he was trying to help the Frierdiker Rebbe in any way he can. They knew how bad it was, whether it was finding out reports from the inside, what have you. And so therefore they understood that to get out of imprisonment and to go into Gullus, into exile, was a huge upgrade. Means like we said, just repeated, that a person who's in exile has choice, a person in prison has no choice. A person in their own life, sometimes you could be in a situation where you're in exile within your own life, in your avodah pratis as an individual, or you're in a prison. We're not talking about physical prisons. We're talking about prisons in your avodas Hashem. You're trapped in your situation. The Rebbe explains. We're talking about exile within a person's situation. When it comes to exile, there's no one that could stop a yid from being connected. It means they could stop Torah mitzvahs like the communists did in not making it able, or the Romans did, or throughout history the Inquisition did. U'kedivrei Baal Simcha Gimmel Tammuz, as the previous Rebbe himself said on the third Tammuz, our bodies have only been put in exile. Our souls, like Nimshul Galus, never given to Galus. A guy, a Gentile, has no Baal Batishkeit, has no ownership over a Jew's soul. I mean, we do not talk politics in our class, but Mamish, the narrative today, even in places of friendliness, unfortunately, is that the Jews should have to be thankful. Everything you have is from us. Whoever heard of such a thing? No word of God mentioned anywhere. Only our bodies nitn begalas were put in galas, but our souls are not put into galas. And whatever is with regard to Torah mitzvahs, you can't change. It means you could stop me from having an esrog. You could stop me from physically putting on tefillin, but you can't stop with the tefillin if I do put on tefillin. You can't disrupt my connection to God, because a person's always connected to God. If I don't have the tefillins, I don't have that specific mitzvah at this specific time. But you can't stop my relationship with God, which is kind of what we're hearing on the streets today. But when a person's in a spiritual imprisonment, a person could be so low, fall so low, unfortunately, in their spiritual being. We're talking about not a place where a person's being imprisoned by others, but you become imprisoned to your external powers. What's the external powers? Putting it lightly, is the impure powers. And the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that's possible. That person so gives themselves over and imprisons themselves to the forces of evil within themselves that they're like a person in prison that has no way to get out of it. It talks in the laws of Torah, the laws of studying Torah. If a person is a sinner and hasn't properly done repentance, even if you perform Torah mitzvahs, what you're performing stays in a place of negativity. They're talking about extreme levels of sinning, where a person could, even by learning, it could be counterproductive. Because by your learning, unfortunately, hopefully no one's ever in this situation. Because you're so imprisoned, so sold to the forces of impurity, that studying Torah they're using you to study Torah to siphon off the energy, and you're adding energy to klipas. Unfortunately, imagine a person falls in such a situation. So the Rebbe says, so therefore, when we understand the physical and the spiritual meaning of imprisonment, we know that when the Rebbe went out on the 3rd of Tammuz to Golus, it was a tremendous upgrade. It was a day of simcha, a day of happiness. The Yois Hayom Sheba Yatzak Vayikdushas Marich Armi Admir Me'amaser. The Frierdiker Rebbe left his imprisonment. Noisiv Lakach, aside for the fact, Sheklolas and Hagas Hamedina Ahi Haisa Bechinas Galas B'Teich Galas. It wasn't like it wasn't like Russia, that Kostroma was a horrible place, but Moscow was this flourishing place of freedom. Whenever the Rebbe spoke about the Soviet Union, he called it Medina Sahi. And throughout history, the Jewish people, things that were so horrible, they didn't even want to mention it by name. For instance, the Romans, were called Malchus HaRussia, the evil empire. So here, the Rebbe says Medina Sahi, that country, he means Russia, the Soviet Union. The whole country was an exile within an exile. Nevertheless, but his imprisonment was much more severe than as bad as it was on the street of Russia. He had absolutely no freedom, totally dependent on the warden. The Rebbe says more than this. When the previous Rebbe was in prison, like I said before, they wanted to put the previous Rebbe to death. And after they scratched that idea, they weren't going to put him to death. And he calls nevertheless, even though he wasn't free from that, from that verdict, only on the 3rd of Tammuz, but nevertheless, as long as he was in prison, there was always the concern. Again, the Rebbe is saying he was involved, that they may change their minds. The famous law in halacha, the same mouth that makes something permissible can make something forbidden. And what happened in the 3rd Tammuz? The previous law, which Rebbe left under the rule of the warden of the prison to be somewhat in his own freedom. He stayed, yes, he has to be in Galus, and we learned to Sicha where the Rebbe said that because when he was in Kostroma, it wasn't like he was staying in the Great Western, and he was who knows what kind of house he had, for whatever, they didn't let him have pen and paper there. And he said, that's the famous Sicha we learned, the Refugee Rebbe says, why do I have a hand if I can't write a letter to someone and to help someone, give someone chizuk, someone encouragement? I think he means that there was many people that were in that situation of the scholars. He says tens to hundreds of thousands. Now, so if that's the case, if Gimmel Tammuz is such a great day, and in some ways even greater than 12 and 13 of Tammuz, why would the previous Rebbe not have made a holiday out of it? The holiday that the previous Rebbe made and celebrated, and this is the day that for Klal Yisrael of freedom. And we look at it that this was the next stage of Yafutza Merezecha Chutza that's leading to Mashiach. So why didn't we start with Gimmel Tammuz? Elarak es hayam yud beis v'yom Tammuz. So Yesh Leimer, the Rebbe says we could say, Kol inyoni shel nasi v'roya Yisrael. What defines? What is everything about a nasi, a leader, and a shepherd of Israel? Neshama Klal is someone who has a general soul. You have to understand something. The way it is taught and understood from Chassidus and other places of Kabbalah and Musar is, in the Zohar, is that a Nasi is not just a person that has something to say, that could teach you something, is another teacher. A Nasi, a prince of Israel, a leader of Israel, is a Neshama Klalis. Their whole makeup is different. They have, like Yaakov Avinu, Moshe Rabbeinu, their soul is a general soul. It's not, they don't have a private soul. Like the previous Rebbe's daughter said by the court case of Hey Tevis, the Rebbe and the Sfarim belong to Chassidim. There's no privacy by a Rebbe. He's a Neshama Klalis, a general soul. That to be a Nasi is not something that's Korach's problem, right? Korach thought he was a leader. He's a nice guy. He's smart. He's rich. He's not a Neshama Klalis. Hey Shana, so the job of a Nasi as being a general soul. What's a general soul mean? That all the souls of every individual that's alive in the time of the generation of the Nasi, that are one of his flock, have a part of his soul in their soul. So therefore, his job is to be mashpia, to give, to provide spiritually and materially for the people of his generation. Shehem HaNeshamas Pratius, because the people of his generation are the individual souls that come from the general soul of the Rebbe. Okay, Yedua, as is known, the Rebbe says, Shinasi v'roya Yisrael, a prince and a shepherd of Israel, maniach es atzmoi, he constantly puts his own privacy and his own well-being on the side, b'shvil kol ish pratim Yisrael, for every individual. V'afilu b'shvil pachashiv v'chusim. And he doesn't say, I'm looking only for quality people. That's not a nasi. If a nasi says that everyone has to do with me, but one person, he's not a nasi. A nasi's job, by definition, is every single Jew is is part of him, has as part of his soul inside of him, and therefore the pachash b'chusim, even someone who's considered, whoever's to describe that, a lowest of the low, is the concern of the nasi. The inyan of apratim and the individual needs doesn't even compare to the needs of someone who's the lowly of the lowlies. I mean, if you could find the person, not that we're judges to find and describe and label people, but if there was such a thing as a clarity of a label of a person, and you were able to find the lowest of low person, that Dasan and Aviron, who don't stop bothering Moshe has to be concerned for them. He admonishes them, he tells them they're doing wrong, but that comes out of concern. How he shows his concern, or how he projects his concern, may seem harsh, may seem with harsh words, but the Dasan and Aviram are also a responsibility of Moshe. Therefore, even though at the day of Gimmel Tammuz, from the Rebbe's perspective, where he's talking about his father-in-law, it was a huge thing because he got out of imprisonment and now he went to Galus. But for the Friedrich Rebbe, it wasn't such a day of celebration, because being a neshama kladis, being a general soul, there's still lack and a break in the communication between the nasi and his flock. Because when he was in Galus, his ability to be openly influential was limited. Like Gimmel Tammuz Liyantiv. Therefore, he didn't make it as a holiday, because as far as the relationship between Rebbe and Chassidim went, they didn't see such a benefit in Gimmel Tammuz. On the contrary, there was a fear the Rebbe is going away for 3 years. Because the full redemption, which is allowed by the relationship between the Rebbe and the Chassid, was still not there yet on the 3rd of Tammuz. The Friedrich Rebbe was taken out of prison, but the Chassidim didn't feel it yet. And again, it's not that there's an individual Chassid or an individual Yid, because the Nasi is a Nasi of all Klal Yisrael. There's certain more people that are important, less important. Every single person is an Nekuda Ikris, is an essential part when it comes to a general soul. Again, by definition, even a Neshama Pratis, a private soul, that is a person of influence, he or she, and has a lot of people that rely on them. But because he or she is a Neshama Pratis, is an individual soul, and the other people in Neshama Pratis, their connection is limited. A Neshama Klal, by definition, every single person is essential. On the highest level, it doesn't make a difference who that person is. That's why everyone went to the Rebbe. Everyone was able to go and have a talk with the Rebbe. There's no one the Rebbe says, what are you doing here? That one person, a person came by, gave the Rebbe books on other religions. The Rebbe took it away from him. But the Rebbe didn't say, what are you doing here? But that's only from the perspective of the Rebbe vis-a-vis Chassidim. Gimmel Tammuz is not such a holiday, because the Chassidim didn't see the benefit of the 3rd Tammuz, because the Rebbe was less accessible in a way. But the Rebbe is talking as a son-in-law. And also from the perspective of a Chassid who's looking at the Rebbe for the Rebbe's sake. It is a day of redemption, and it is a day of simcha, of joy. Therefore, the Rebbe says, again, this is very much applicable to Gimmel Tammuz now, because on Gimmel Tammuz became the passing of the Rebbe many years later, 1994. So the Rebbe says, when we're talking about iskashrus from the word kesher, to tie, to knot, to knot together, of the relationship of a chassid, the Rebbe, the chassidim, to the Rebbe and the Nasi, the Rebbe and the head of the generation. So a connection of a chassid to the Rebbe has to be in such a way in everything, even as far as an individual goes. The Rebbe says it's not only when you say love your fellow Jew, it's not just to love your fellow Jew that you love another Jew or the Rebbe loves you. It also that you love the Rebbe. The Chassid has to love the Rebbe. So this Rebbe says that there is, as far as you're concerned, you're allowed to look at the Rebbe as he had an individual victory. That he had an individual, you can't say, well, you're a Rebbe, so therefore Gimmel Tammuz means nothing. But the Rebbe, as far as you're concerned, the Rebbe also has a pratiyus, even though he himself doesn't view it that way. And therefore your love for the Rebbe should be to celebrate with him Gimmel Tammuz. Even shemeduber oidis neshama klolis. Haigam inyoni apratim shayach l'chol Yisrael. And the Rebbe says on the flip side, again, because the Rebbe is a general soul, even if what he's celebrating is private, but even his privacy is connected to the Klal Yisrael, and therefore, even though we don't benefit from it, but if he benefits from it, and our avos Yisrael towards the Rebbe, and our avos of a Chassid towards the Rebbe, so therefore it is a celebration for us. And as the Rebbe spoke many times, especially in 1999, 89, and other times in Gimmel Tammuz, that even for the Chassidim, it really was the beginning of the redemption. It only revealed itself on the 12th day. So therefore, the Chassidim only saw it on the 12th, therefore they celebrated on the 12th. But even for the Chassidim, the fact, how did we get to the 12th of Tammuz, which when the Frierdiker Rebbe was totally released and eventually made his way after 13 years to America, was that it all started on the 3rd of Tammuz. Valpiza, the Rebbe says, based on all this, Nimsa, turns out, Gimmel Tammuz Richa Liyas Sasimcha Eitz Chassidim. The 3rd of Tammuz has to be a day of joy by Chassidim. Yoisim Asher Eitzel Rebbe, even more than the joy than the Rebbe has. Why? The Rebbe's whole concern is for the individuals. And the Rebbe was a little down. Why? To say, because for the Chassidim, they didn't see the redemption. But from our perspective, we have to look at the Rebbe also as an individual. I mean, he as a Chassid, for obvious Yisrael, the Rebbe, you don't have to say to the Rebbe, you know the famous story. Shmuel Munkus knocked on the Alter Rebbe's door. Shmuel Munkus was a big Chassid Alter Rebbe. He was a joker, but a big tzaddik. Everything about him was mysterious. So Shmuel Munkus knocked on the Alter Rebbe's door in the middle of the night. The Alter Rebbe says, they always had banter between each other. They always had a few harsh words between each other, the Rebbe and Chassid. So the Rebbe, he knocks on the Alter Rebbe's door at night. The Rebbe says, who's there? He says, Shmuel Munkus. Shmuel. He says, what are you doing here? It's the middle of the night. So he says to the Rebbe, I didn't know there's night by the Rebbe. So I mean, that's, he was always giving the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe a hard time. But the idea is that for Chassidim, as a prat, the Frierdiker Rebbe had a freedom. Is Iker Nyani Hu B'Shvil and Shamas Pratim. Negei Aleim Ari B'Gimmel Tammuz Eisek Gula B'Hela. V'ilu Chassidim Tzrich Lachshav Al Rebbe Gam B'Tur Prat. But as a Chassid, we have to see the Rebbe. He has an individuality. At least we have to view it that way. Tzrich Nias B'Gimmel Tammuz B'Simcha Gedayla means the Rebbe is saying an amazing thing, that even if the Frierdiker Rebbe himself, because from his perspective, all he wants is that Chassidim should have, and everything should be revealed. So he didn't look at Gimmel Tammuz maybe as such a simcha. But from the Chassidim's perspective, on the contrary, the Frierdiker Rebbe was free from imprisonment, at least, even though he was in exile. But he was safe. There wasn't a risk of them turning the verdict back to death, God forbid. Because that began the Rebbe's redemption as an individual. But Goli was clear. He's no longer in prison. So the Rebbe says that Gimmel Tammuz is a special Yom Tov for Chassidim. It's an amazing thing that the Rebbe is saying that Gimmel Tammuz is a time for Chassid to be had, because it's a redemption for the Rebbe. I'm too small to apply this to Gimmel Tammuz in 1994, but one could imagine there's an idea there as well. The Rebbe says, based on all this that we said, surely we're going to Fabrein Ad Lachri Avdallah straight through the afternoon. Not just the Gimmel Tammuz. So those who are today's Matzah Gimmel Tammuz for those in the United States. So that by me it's already Friday, but the Rebbe says it's not just the day itself; it's the day afterwards. Ad l'chag Geulah. The Rebbe says you should bring every day until the 12th and 13th of Tammuz. Then we have to even add more as a simcha in Yud Beis Tammuz. Now you have 10 minutes. Let's go. This is a famous talk. Isa b'Seder Olam. There's a book called Seder Olam. What's the book Seder Olam? The book Seder Olam tells us, it's a medrash that tells us what days different things happened. We have a lot of things in our history. We just don't know what days they were. Seder Olam kind of organizes all the happenings of the Jewish people's history. One of the things that it tells us about is the first time Gimmel Tammuz shows up in our history. The Gimmel Tammuz Mana, it says in Seder Olam that should be Gimmel Tammuz Mana Yeshua. On the third of Tammuz, Yehoshua, meaning the successor and student of Moshe, the one who brought the Jewish people into the land. Roish Lekoivshim, there it says the head of all conquerors. Es ha-mahalach ha-shemesh ba'imrei shemesh b'givan dom. He stopped the sun's movement. He said shemesh b'givan dom. Dom means stop. Why? Because the Jewish people needed the light to continue fighting. They didn't have floodlights, whatever they're called. So they needed more sunlight. So what does Yeshua do? When if you need more sunlight, you just stop the sun from moving. Well, Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar Iser, and the Pirkei of Rabbi Elazar is also a medrash, says, it wasn't just that the sun stopped, the whole Seder Shtalshlus, the whole system stopped. All the galaxies stopped moving. Everything froze in a good way, meaning that the sun stayed. It's the Gemara, there's different opinions. How long did things stop? Lamed Vav Shois, Ayayim Tamim. Was it 24 hours or 36 hours? But according to all opinions, when did this miracle happen? On the 3rd of Tammuz. The Rebbe say nothing's by chance. Everything's by divine providence. So why did this happen on Gimmel Tammuz? And then, like we know, whenever something happens, every year, there's that energy of something that happened in all years. So there's the energy of stopping the sun on the 3rd of Tammuz. If things continue to move, the cycle of life, sun rises, the sun sets, Gimmel Tammuz's day, the sun doesn't set. It's an auspicious day for the sun to stay put. Therefore, the Rebbe says we have to say, of course, everyone applied this to Gimmel Tammuz of 1994, that the sun didn't set. The Gemara in Shabbos says, the sun rises, the sun sets. A tzaddik comes, a tzaddik goes. A nasi comes, a nasi goes. The sun set on Gimmel Tammuz, 1994. So the Rebbe says, but the Rebbe said in 1958 that the redemption that happened on 3rd of Tammuz wasn't by chance that it was the 3rd of Tammuz. It happened because it's connected. Whatever happened in Gimmel Tammuz, but the Rebbe is going to explain now. What happened in Gimmel Tammuz in 1927, it's connected with the energy and the inspiration of the idea of the sun stopped moving on the 3rd of Tammuz for Joshua. The Rebbe says, what does this mean? What's doim? Doim actually doesn't mean to stop moving. Doim actually means to go silent. Because the sun, we know, the tradition is, why did Avram Avinu analyze the sun and the stars and everything to learn about God? Because we're supposed to learn, like the Rambam writes in Sefer Yad, that if a person looks at the sun and the moon, you see how everything's constantly moving towards God. You can learn from creation, their awareness and consciousness and service to God. The sun is moving always towards bowing to God. And it's always the soul of the sun. The Rebbe calls it Nefesh HaShemesh. There's a soul of the sun. The Rambam writes in the first 8 chapters, that the galaxies have a much greater das, whatever that means, a much greater understanding than humans could ever possibly have. So there's the soul of the sun. Doim Ilai Mashir. So if it's not moving, it's not doing what it should be doing. What it should be doing, it's supposed to be praising God. All creation is constantly praising God. And in its movement, it's praising God. Joshua stopped it from moving and stopped praising God. And because he stopped moving him, the sun was no longer bowing to God. It's moving always towards bowing to God. Sivuv Hashem, which is the cycle of the sun. Shiras HaMelachim, because of that, we know that when Yaakov was holding the angel and when he was fighting with Esav, the sun started to rise. He says, I need to go. Why? Because they all had their slots to say Shira to God. When the sun was starting to rise, it was his slot, or its slot. So the sun, if it stops moving, everything stops. The angels stop saying praise. Shiras HaMelachim, who Aidei Shegila. As Smilas, Shiras HaNeshamas, Shiras HaMelachim. I think we actually learned this Sicha once. Why? Because for Yeshua, we learned that it was more important for people, whatever, that the people should say Shira, which is connected to the war, than for the angels and the creation to say Shira. The Rebbe says, what does this mean? Before Chassidus it explains, although we have all the verses and described by the prophets in Yeshai and Yecheskel about the various different praises of the angels, Yesh Gam Shiras and Neshamas, the souls also praise God or sing to God. We know that souls have elevations. We do what you call Hilach V'Aliyu Aidei Shir Davka. And one of the rules are, the Alter Rebbe says, Kol Bali Shir Nimshachim B'Shir. Shir really means in the halach, it's talking about a leash. But also Shir can mean a song. That all movement is with song. You can't move without having a tune to yourself. You have to have a tune. Doesn't mean you have to be shouting a song. But all movements of the soul happens with song. That all the people of song move with song and get pulled with song. Song moves a person, moves the soul. So what's the difference between the song, the shira of the angels, and the shira of the souls? The angels have bodies, although they're not our kind of bodies. They're only made of two elements, of ruach and eish, of wind and fire, but they have bodies. Their souls are only made up of two of the refined elements, ruach and eish. They have no offer. The physical body, the main part of a physical body, right? Like the Torah says, the body is mainly, has water as well, but mainly has the earth. That's a man was made from earth. The angels don't have earth or water. The two heavier of the four elements. They only have the lighter two, which are, and the refined two, which are the wind and fire. It's a clear verse. He makes his angels ruchais, serving eish of passion. Because the angels have bodies. What is a goof? A goof is chomer, is coarse. Now, obviously, the soul, the body of an angel doesn't come close to the coarseness of our bodies, of human bodies, but it's still a body, and therefore the point of the singing is to nullify the coarseness of their body, whatever that means, to God. They have to refine the coarseness of their body. So therefore, he says, it says that the prophet Yeshaya says he heard the angels say Kaddish, Kaddish, Kaddish. How could he hear it? It's because of the body element of the angel. If it was just the soul of the angel, the prophet wouldn't hear it. Because it's a body, right? So the body has to make a sound. So the refined ear of the prophet hears the sound. So Yeshaya hear the Kaddish, Kaddish, Kaddish. Masha ein kain, however, but the souls have no body. Klal at all, not even ruach or eish. Therefore, we never hear about the songs of the souls. The prophets don't describe it because they can't hear it. They can only hear the songs of the angels. So what is the idea of the singing of the souls versus the singing of the angels? It's all about movement. It's not about nullifying the coarseness of the body, but it's all about refining the coarseness of the body. But it's all about the yearning and the movement, Ratzo, the yearning towards V'Shov and back of love and fear for God. It's emotional. We know that fear and love are the wings that a soul flies with. What causes the movement, the love and the fear? What fans it is contemplation about the greatness of God. Pnimiyus HaTorah. And what does that mean to us? When we study Chassidus. When a person studies Chassidus, Pnimiyus HaTorah, the inner secrets of Torah, that gives his bonus, that gives contemplation, it gives excitement and movement to the soul. So what did Joshua say? Joshua says, the sun has to move. So the creation Because even the sun has a body and soul, right? You said the nefesh is shemesh. So the angels sing according to the movement of the sun. So in order for the angels to sing, that's not so important. As important as it is, not as important as the singing of the souls. And therefore, right now, the souls need the sun to stay put. Joshua did show it. Means basically, I think it was either this talk or another talk we learned to the Rebbe. But basically, the question was, what justification did Joshua have to stop Seder Shtalshus? How could he stop the creation? He's stopping the sun and everything stops because Joshua needs to fight a war, right? That's, again, the narrative of today. You want to fight a war, everyone has to stop because you want to fight a war? Yes. You know why? Because it's more important for the souls to sing than anything that's going to happen with the movement of the sun. Therefore, the angels become nullified. And they stop saying their songs or praise. Therefore, it stops. The sun stops. The sun goes silent. And the moon stops. The Rebbe says, let's just finish this last part of the Sicha. What's the lesson for us? Everything in Torah has to be an everlasting lesson. If you're going to reveal the essence of your soul through studying Chassidus, even the sun will stop for that. Everything that comes and God gives flow through the sun and the moon. Like it says, God gives flow physically through the sun and the moon. If it's about getting closer to Pnimiyus HaTorah, to the Pnimiyus of the Neshama, not only won't he disturb a Jewish person, they help us, and if they have to stop, they will stop. If the sun has to stop, so a person could reveal the etzem and Neshama, the essence of your soul, then the sun will stop for you. Like Joshua ruled over the sun, every Jew has the ability, because it's the same idea. If your soul needs to sing, the sun will stop for you. And they become a chariot to what you need for God. This is what happened on Gimmel Tammuz. Because what was the Friedrich Rebbe doing? He was spreading Torah in Yiddishkeit. He wasn't in prison for anything else. And he brought it eternally. He was teaching Chassidus. Therefore, anything in the world, everything has to stop for what the Friedrich Rebbe is doing. Not only won't it get in the way, it helps it. Everyone eventually saw this was a big miracle. And through the actions of the Friedrich Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe says he was the head of all conquerors. He paved the way. And he empowered us. For all those who love Torah mitzvahs. Shomer mitzvahs, those who keep the mitzvahs. Anyone who could call himself a Jew, a Yisrael. When a person learns the teachings of Chassidus, you become the ruler, you become the balabas on the sun and the moon. And not only should the physicality or lack of it disrupt your moving forward in your growth and spreading of Torah and Avodah. On the contrary, you could dictate how it should be. Because all of this is to fulfill the final desire of Hashem of making this place a dwelling place for Hashem. Thank you everyone for joining. I got to run. Have a wonderful Shabbos, and we'll see you guys in the next class.
Good Shabbos,